Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm your host, Tony Perkins. So glad to have you with us as we continue our coverage here at the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom with over 1,000 representatives from about 130 countries for this week. This is the second time. Last year was the first. And I want to address in this segment a report from the United Kingdom on the persecution of Christians. Now, this preliminary report came out a couple of months ago, right after the USERF report came out. But what is quite fascinating about this report and enlightening is that they found that the overwhelming majority, estimated at 80% of the persecuted religious individuals around the world, are Christians. And they said Christianity is at risk of disappearing in some parts of the world, and anti-Christian persecution is increasing in severity. Joining me now is the Right Reverend Philip Mounstephen, a British Anglican bishop and missionary. He has been the Bishop of Truro since November 2018. Beforehand, he served as executive leader of the Church of the Mission Society and worked for the Church Pastoral Aid Society, and was asked to do this independent report by the Foreign Secretary of the UK. Bishop, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you for being here in the United States at this ministerial. I'm just going to jump right into this. One of the aspects of this report that has gained so much attention, in fact, when I was briefing the Vice President on the USERF report, he commented on your report the fact that you estimate 80% of the persecuted believers around the world, the faithful, are Christians.
I know, and it is a shocking figure. That figure comes from the International Society for Human Rights. You won't actually find it on their website anymore, and we did dig into that with them. It was a figure from about 10 years ago, but we talked to them, and they said that they were confident in that figure. They want to launch fresh research into it, but not only were they confident about that figure, but they reckon that that is a conservative estimate of the situation now. And I think I don't want for 1 minute to ignore the way that members of other faiths are persecuted, and there's some appalling things happening. I mean, what's happening to the Uyghur Muslims in China is absolutely outrageous. But I think that the fact is that the Christian faith today is the one true global faith, and this is a global phenomenon that we're facing. So in that sense, it's not surprising that Christians are more in the firing line than any other faith. One of the things we say in the report, this is a single global phenomenon, but it has multiple drivers in multiple different places. So it's not surprising, as I say, that a truly global faith like the Christian faith should be significantly more on the firing line than any other.
Now, you were quoted as saying political correctness as a reason. Political correctness is a reason that people are afraid to stand up for religious liberty. Quote, the sense of misguided political correctness that has stopped us standing up for the Christians overseas must end.
That was actually the words of the British Foreign Secretary, but I don't disagree with them. I think there, certainly in the British mindset, I think there are lots of things going on. I think there's because we have this long historic Christian tradition, but in many ways large parts of society have moved away from it. I think there's an embarrassment about the Christian faith. I think there's a failure to recognize that the Christian faith is predominantly a global faith and a predominant phenomenon of the global south, and therefore of the global poor. I think there's a great sense of post-colonial guilt around as well that I think has influenced the Foreign Office, and a kind of mentality that says, well, we interfered uninvited in these places in the past, and we shouldn't do so now. So there's a lot of I think there is a political correctness thing as well that says, well, who are we to tell anyone else what to do? And the net effect of that, I think, is that we've turned a blind eye when we really shouldn't have done, and we've failed to live up to our moral responsibilities in the whole area.
Well, Bishop, if that continues, does that not probably fuel even greater religious persecution, because if you see one of the world's largest denominations, which also happens to be one of the largest persecuted denominations or faiths, if they are abandoned, where's going to be the motivation to reach other faith groups that are being persecuted?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the recommendations that we formulated for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office are, very clear that we think the British government, and I would say this to all governments, need to stand up for the freedom of religion or belief for everybody.
Right.
This is foundational. This is what Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is all about. There are various reasons why we've said that. One of the reasons is a very pragmatic reason, that if you are seen in some parts of the world to favour the Christian community over others, you actually make that community more vulnerable, and that's a real risk and
Right.
something we really need
Good point.
to avoid. I think I'd also want to say it's absolutely not part of the Christian tradition for us to seek special favours for ourselves.
Right.
So, our duty is to love our neighbour as ourselves, whoever that neighbour may be.
I was going to ask you about that, because that's also part of the Christian faith, is to accept persecution,
Yeah, it is.
rejection, to operate in meekness. So it's not necessarily to push back. And I'm wondering if that's a part of this.
I think, I absolutely accept. I think it is part of our Christian discipleship to reckon that we may well face opposition. But equally, I don't think that's a recipe for us to be kind of to sit on the sidelines when we see our brothers and sisters being.
No, I absolutely
persecuted.
agree with that. I think from the perspective of us in the United States, Britain, we should speak up for
Absolutely.
those, because we have a voice, we have the ability to shape policy. Bishop, we're up against a break. I want to ask you if you'll stick around for just a moment,
Yeah,
and
glad to.
we want to continue this conversation. A very enlightening and troubling report out of the UK on the persecution of Christians in particular, but people of all faiths around the world. All right, folks, don't go away. We're going to come back with more from the second annual Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom here at the State Department in Washington, D.C. We'll be back with more on the other side of this break. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm your host, Tony Perkins. So glad to have you with us on this Wednesday afternoon as we continue our coverage of the second annual Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom, hosted here at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. Continuing my conversation with the Bishop of Truro, Philip Mounstephen. Bishop, thanks for sticking around again.
My pleasure.
Excellent work in this report. We were discussing some of the reasons that the Christian faith occupy 80% of the persecuted around the world. We were talking about, number one, Christians don't necessarily push back, which doesn't absolve us in other places where we have our freedoms to advocate for them.
Sure.
But there's certain to be some additional underlying reasons for this.
Absolutely. I think this was one of the things that was really something of an eye-opener to me. If you just kind of pan back historically, and when I was a student at university, I belonged to the Eastern European Prayer Group, and we prayed for persecuted Christians behind the Iron Curtain. It wasn't a uniform picture, but we know that there were a number of people, for instance, particularly in the Soviet Union, who suffered pretty appalling persecution. The Berlin Wall fell, and I think we kind of felt this thing had receded and kind of disappeared. And it seems to me it's just kind of crept up on us over the last few years and grown into something that is global in scope. And I was shocked by the scale, the scope, and the severity of the whole thing. Now, we then need to ask why. What's going on? And I think that there are at least 4 really serious global factors that we need to take into account. One of them is the rise of religious fundamentalism, bigotry that manifests itself in violence, and that is from a number of religious traditions, certainly not just Islam. Secondly, the rise of authoritarian governments that brook no dissent. Then you've got militant nationalism that again identifies one religious community, one religious tradition as being authentic to that expression of nationalism, and therefore, pushes hard against others. And you also got to have a phenomenon of kind of criminal activity, gang activity on an industrial scale, often driven by drugs, where you've got weak governments. I mean, it was a real shock to me that the most dangerous place in the world to be a Roman Catholic priest is in Mexico, because you have these gangs who are, subverting society, and the people who stand in the way are the priests and the pastors, and they are literally in the firing line. So, I think there are two reasons why we really, really, really need to care about this issue. One is there's a moral imperative to look after people of faith, and the 80% of Christians who are, I count as my brothers and sisters in Christ around the world. But actually, there's some really important pragmatic political reasons why we should do this as well, because there's some really ugly things going on in the world today. And I think religious persecution is often it's the bellwether, it's the canary in the mine. You see that going on. There's and you think about how this impacts upon other, fundamental human rights, where religious persecution is happening. You're going to be finding people trafficking. You're going to be finding forced conversion, forced marriage. Terrible gender inequality, gender-based violence, denial of freedom of expression, denial of a shed load of other human rights. And I always want to say, I think the right of freedom of religion or belief, as it's enshrined in Article 18, is the foundational human right on which every other one depends.
Absolutely.
You see that violated, you can be pretty certain there's some pretty ugly things going on.
But if you get this one right, you have a greater chance of seeing the other freedoms established.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I think it is therefore foundational. This is a fundamental right. When it's denied, you see all sorts of other things falling with it. When it's maintained and asserted, I think then you find plural, tolerant societies being developed that are less of a threat to security, and simply make better places to do business. They make better trading partners as well, because they are inherently more stable communities.
We just got a couple minutes left, and I want to get to this. I know this was for the Foreign Secretary there in the United Kingdom, but it has application elsewhere. What are some of the recommendations? How do we address this correctly?
Yeah, there are a number of recommendations we made out. So I'm basically been sent to Foreign Commonwealth Office. You need to mainstream in this in your thinking, in your activity. Don't see this as a sidebar issue. See it as central. Become much more religiously literate as an organisation. You'll do your job better if you understand how the rest of the world thinks in terms of faith. Don't be afraid to use the levers that you've got, the seat on the UN Security Council, etc. Step up to the plate, basically.
And those are some of the same aspects that this administration is looking at here in the United States, that has put a greater point on religious freedom. And I think it's critical. I think what we're seeing, a growing body of research shows that if you get this right, you have greater economic development, you have a greater social stability and security, and that serves all of mankind well.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely right. Yeah.
Bishop, thanks so much for taking time to join us today.
Been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Very, very enlightening. And folks, you can see a copy. We're going to have a link to this on our website. This type of information is very instructive, and I'm grateful to see, as we were talking about yesterday with the Hungarian government stepping up, the UK. I'm actually hoping that this creates even greater push for the United States government to continue to focus on this issue as they have.